Chapter VI. The Case Against Anne. The contradictory qualities of Mrs. Perry's nature came out strongly in connection with the Rickwell tragedy. When Miss Denham was prosperous, the old woman had nothing but bad to say of her. Now that she was a fugitive and generally credited with a crime, Mrs. Perry stood up for her stoutly. She made herself acquainted with all details, and delivered her verdict to Mrs. Morley, on whom she called for the express purpose of giving her opinion. "I never liked the woman," she said impressively. "She was artful and frivolous, and to gain admiration behaved in a brazen way of which I thoroughly disapproved. All the same, I do not believe she killed the girl." "But the evidence is strongly against her," expostulated Mrs. Morley. "And how many people have been hanged on evidence which has afterwards been proved incorrect?" retorted Mrs. Perry. "I don't care how certain they are of her guilt. In my opinion she is an innocent woman. I am glad she has escaped." "I am not sorry myself," sighed the other. "I was fond of Anne, for she had many good points. But Mr. Steele says—" "Who is Mr. Steele?" "The detective who has charge of the case." "I thought the police from Chelmsford had it in hand." "Of course. Mr. Morley sent for the police the morning after poor Daisy's death. That is 3 days ago. To-morrow the inquest is to be held. I suppose they will bring a verdict against poor Miss Denham." "Ha!" said Mrs. Perry, rubbing her nose. "And my greengrocer is on the jury. Much he knows about the matter. But this Steele creature, where does he come from?" "Mr. Morley sent to London for him. He has a private inquiry office, I believe." "No such thing," contradicted Mrs. Perry. "He is from Scotland Yard. A genuine detective. None of your makeshifts." "I thought you knew nothing about him." "Nor did I till this minute. But I now remember seeing his name in connection with the theft of Lady Summersdale's diamonds. He caught the thief in a very clever way. Steele. Martin Steele. I remember now. So he has the case in hand. Humph! He won't accuse Anne Denham, you may be sure of that. He's too clever." "But he is convinced of her guilt," said the other triumphantly. "Then the man's a fool. I'll see him myself." Mrs. Perry did so the very next day after the inquest had been held and the verdict given. She possessed a small, neat cottage on the outskirts of Rickwell, standing some distance back from the high road. Seated at her drawing-room window, she could see all those who came or went, and thus kept a watch over the morals of the village. This window was called Mrs. Perry's Eye, and everyone sneaked past it in constant dread of the terrible old lady who looked through it. Beyond Mrs. Perry's cottage were the houses of the gentry and the church. Therefore she knew that Steele would pass her house on the way to the Elms, where he would doubtless go to report himself to Morley. To be sure, Morley was to be at the inquest, but Mrs. Perry took no account of that. He and the detective would certainly return to the Elms to compare notes. Also, there was another chance. Steele might go on to see Ware at his place, which was a mile beyond the village. Giles had caught a cold after his midnight ride in search for the missing motor, and since then had been confined to his bed. His deposition had been taken down in writing for the benefit of the jury, as he could not be present himself. Since he was deeply interested in the matter, Steele would probably go and tell him about the inquest. Mrs. Perry therefore posted herself at the window about 12 and waited for the detective. At 12:30 she saw him come along, having on the previous day made herself acquainted with his personality. He was a dapper, pert little man, neat in his dress and suave in his manners. Not at all like the detective of fiction as known to Mrs. Perry. There was no solemnity or hint of mystery about Mr. Steele. He would pass unnoticed in a crowd, and no one would take him for a bloodhound of the law. He did not even possess the indispensable eagle eye, nor did he utter opinions with the air of an oracle. In fact, when Mrs. Perry captured him and lured him into her parlor, she was exceedingly disappointed with his appearance. "No one would even take you for a detective," said she brusquely, whereat Steel laughed cheerily. "All the better for me, ma'am. Folks speak more freely when they don't know my business. But you will excuse me," he added, glancing at his watch. "I am in a hurry. You say you know something about this matter?" It was on this pretence that Mrs. Parry had got him into her house, else he would not have wasted his time on her. She had therefore to make good her words, but had not the slightest chance of doing so. "I know that Anne Denham is innocent," was all she could say, but said it with the air of one who settles a difficult matter once and for all. "On what grounds, ma'am?" "On no grounds, save those of my own common sense." "You have no evidence to—" "I have the evidence of my own eyes. You haven't seen the woman. I have. She is not the kind of person who would act so." "The jury take a different view," said Steel dryly. "They have brought in a verdict of wilful murder against her." "Fools! But what can you expect from a parcel of tradesmen? I wish to hear on what grounds they made such idiots of themselves." Steel was somewhat taken aback by this coolness. "You must really excuse me," said he, rising, "but I have to see Mr. Ware." "All in good time, Steel," said the old lady coolly. "You might do worse than spend an hour with me. There is precious little going on in this parish I don't know of. I might be able to help you in your search." "After this woman?" Steel shook his head. "I don't think so. I expect she has escaped to foreign parts." "Oh, I know all about that. I made Trim tell me. You know Trim, of course. He was a groom once." "Isn't he a groom now?" "Well," Mrs. Parry rubbed her nose, "you might call him an engineer. When Ware started a motor car Trim refused to let anyone else attend to his young master but himself. He was the servant of old Ware, and thinks it is his duty to look after the son. Not but what it's needed," added Mrs. Parry spitefully. "But Trim learned how to work the car, and so he is what you might call an engineer." "All very interesting, ma'am, but I have an appointment." "It will keep," replied Mrs. Parry suavely. "You had better wait, Steel. I have something to show you." "In connection with the case?" "In connection with Miss Denham." "What is it? Show it to me." "All in good time, Steel. I must first know what you think of the matter." "I think that this woman is guilty." "Oh, you do you? Humph! And I thought you clever. How easily one can be deceived. However, you can sit down and tell me your grounds for this preposterous belief." Steel hesitated. In all his career, and it had been a varied one, he had never met before with anyone like this determined old dame. She took possession of him in the calmest way, and was evidently bent upon pumping him dry before he left the house. As a rule, Steel was not a man to be pumped, but after some reflection he concluded that it was just as well to use a sprat to catch a mackerel. In plain English, he determined, with reservations, to gratify Mrs. Parry's curiosity, so that he might get a sight of what she had to show him. If he were reticent, she would show him nothing; whereas, if he told her all about the evidence at the inquest, and that was public property, she would certainly open her mind to him. Moreover, Steel knew the value of having a gossip like Mrs. Parry to aid him in gaining knowledge of the neighborhood. Finally, he saw that she was a shrewd, matter-of-fact old person, and for the sake of making his work easy it would be as well to conciliate her. He therefore sat down with a cheerful air and prepared himself for an interesting conversation. "I shall be perfectly candid with you," said he, taking out his notes. "These are the memoranda I made at the inquest." "Humph! You have a bad memory, I see. Said Mrs. Parry with emphasis, "I carry all I know in my head. Go on." Steel detailed the facts of the case. He related the threat of Anne against Daisy overheard by Mrs. Morley; read out a copy of the anonymous letter, emphasized the presence of Anne in the library for the few minutes Morley was absent, when she would have had time to secure the stiletto, and explained how Morley had found the very weapon near the scene of the crime. Then he continued to relate what took place in church during the midnight service. Martha James, said he, was sitting not far from Miss Kent. The corner was rather dark. "The whole church is badly lighted," interrupted Mrs. Parry. "I never could bear smelly kerosene lamps." "The corner was dark," resumed Steele patiently, "and Martha, as she says, having a headache, was rather inattentive to the sermon. She saw a man near the door, a tall man, with a great coat and a white scarf. She couldn't see his face plainly. He slipped along the wall during the sermon, when the attention of everyone was fixed on the preacher, and, as Martha saw, slipped a scrap of paper into the hand of Miss Kent. She started, and bending towards a near lamp, read the paper." "Did anyone else see her read it?" "No. She placed the paper in her prayer book, and so contrived to read it without exciting suspicion. Martha saw the action because she was well placed for observation." "And couldn't mind her own business. I know Martha James. Go on." "After a few minutes Miss Kent seemed to grow faint, and slipped out of the church. Another witness, Samuel Gibbs, says that as she brushed past him she murmured that she felt unwell. However, she went out." "And the tall man also?" "No. He remained for another 10 minutes. Martha James watched him because she could not think why he did not follow Miss Kent after giving her the paper." "Of course, Martha thought of something bad," sniffed Mrs. Parry. "No doubt she believed that the two had arranged to meet. So the tall man went out 10 minutes afterwards. What about Anne?" "She was a few pews behind, and apparently inattentive, but a small girl called Cissy Jinks—" "A most precocious child," interpolated the lady. "She is smart," admitted Steele. "Well, she declares that Miss Denham was watching the tall man all the time. Whether she saw him give the paper to Miss Kent no one seems to know. I think myself she must have done so, if she was as watchful as Cissy Jinks declares. Moreover, she followed the tall man when he went out." "Immediately?" "5 minutes afterwards." "Ha! Then it was a quarter of an hour before she followed Daisy. Humph! Didn't Trim see them come out of the church?" "The groom? No, he was at the lych gate with the car, and the snow was falling fast. Besides, the night was so dark that he could see nothing. The first intimation he had of Miss Denham was when she came through the lych gate to tell him that his master was with Miss Kent on the way to the Elms, and wished to see him. Trim followed, and left her in charge of the car. When he was gone she went off, leaving the body of the girl behind her. The case is dead against her." "As you make it out, it certainly is," said Mrs. Parry scathingly. "But what about the tall man? What became of him?" "He has vanished, and no one seems to know anything about him." "Ha!" said the old lady with satisfaction. "Well, I can enlighten you on that point. He was the man who called to see Mr. Morley, and who left just before Anne entered the library." "Are you sure? Morley said nothing about that." "Morley can hold his tongue when necessary," said the old lady dryly. "Yes, that was the man. The footman at the Elms told me that Mr. Morley's visitor wore a great coat and a white scarf." "The same dress," murmured Steele, "and the man was afterwards in church. He passed a note and went out apparently to see Miss Kent. I must question Mr. Morley about him. I wonder if he went away in the motor also." "Of course he did," replied Mrs. Parry calmly. "Anne was watching him, according to Cissy Jinks, and she followed him 5 minutes later. It would seem that she knew him, and after he killed Daisy helped him to escape." "What do you say?" asked Steele, wrinkling his brows, "that this man killed Miss Kent?" "The evidence is nearly as strong against him as against Anne. He was in the library also, and might have obtained the stiletto. It was he who lured Daisy out of the church, He was 5 minutes absent before Anne followed. Quite long enough for him to kill the poor girl." "It sounds feasible, I admit," said the detective thoughtfully. "But even if this is true, it incriminates Miss Anne. She helped him to escape, according to your theory. She must, therefore, have known about the murder, and that makes her an accessory after the fact. In any case, she should be arrested." "But not hanged," insisted Mrs. Parry. "I am sure she did not kill the girl. As for the man, she had a strong reason to get him out of the way, but that does not say she knew of the crime." "I don't see what other reason she could have had," said Steel. "I daresay you are right, and that this stranger did go with Miss Denham on the car. What a pity no one saw them." "Did no one see the car?" "No, it was found overturned in a hedge near Tilbury." "I know," said Mrs. Parry, not liking to have her omniscience questioned. "Trim told me. He came on the car by chance. It was quite cold. The furnace was extinguished. It must have been abandoned for some time when he came across it. I wonder where the pair went then." "You seem certain that the stranger was with Miss Denham." "Yes, I am quite satisfied on that point. Tilbury. Ha! They were making for Tilbury. Did you inquire there?" Steel nodded. "I could find no trace of them. No one saw them, or rather her, for I asked only after Miss Denham. It is my opinion that they must have got on board some ship and have escaped to foreign parts. I could not learn of any ship having left that night, though. Well, that is all the evidence, Mrs. Parry, and you can see for yourself that the case against Miss Denham is almost conclusive." "All the same, I believe she is innocent," insisted the old lady. "It was the man who committed the crime. Ask Morley about him." "Do you think he knows anything?" "Not of the murder, but he must know the man's name. And now, as you have been so frank with me, I'll show you what I promised. Do you remember the anonymous letter and the reference to the Scarlet Cross?" "Yes. Miss Denham said that her father, who is now dead, wore a red enamelled cross on his watch chain." "I know. Mrs. Morley told me so. Now see here." Mrs. Parry opened her left hand, which for some time she had kept clenched. In her palm lay a small gold cross, enamelled red. "Where did you get that?" asked Steel, astounded. "Mrs. Bates, the pew opener, found it in the church and brought it to me. It was found near the spot where the stranger stood." "What?" Steel started to his feet. "Ah, you are beginning to see now," said the old lady. "Yes, Steel, you may well look. Anne is innocent. On the evidence of this cross I believe that her father is not dead. He was the stranger. He killed Daisy, and because he was her father Anne aided him to escape." End of Chapter 6. Read by Céline Major.